I must talk to you about something some of you are going to want to talk about. It's very notable how this shapes up. I have a tendency to do the Calvin Coolidge rule. My management philosophy is the Calvin Coolidge rule, and it rarely ever lets you down. In fact, I can't recall it letting me down. The Calvin Coolidge rule comes from President Calvin Coolidge, the greatest president the world has ever known. And Calvin Coolidge once said, when you see 10 troubles bounding down the road in your direction, if you stand still, 9 out of 10 of them will bound off the road before they get to you, leaving you the problem to deal with. Now, oftentimes, you and I, we decide we just don't want to look at the problem. We don't want to confront the problem. And we're seeing there's a problem out there right now. There are all sorts of warning signs that there is a problem. And it is best, I think, to pay attention to the problem instead of hiding from the problem or pretending the problem doesn't exist, because the left has done that for the last 4 years. And I think Republicans have an opportunity, particularly Donald Trump, has an opportunity to show great responsibility and leadership by telling the American public, for 4 years, the Biden administration propped up the American economy artificially. We are ending the artificial propping up the economy. And yes, there is going to be a dynamic change in the economy. And for a short time, it may get a little rocky as we fix the economy, because the economy right now is dependent on government largesse, and we need the economy dependent on the private sector. And be honest with people and tell them this, that this is what has happened. 25% of jobs created in the last 2 years were government-created jobs, not jobs in the private sector. Most of the money paid into the private sector was money coming from the public sector, and the result is that our national debt is now higher than it has ever been, and debt service for the first time in American history is more than what we spend on anything else in the budget, including defense, and we've got to change that. I am someone, for example, who supports robust foreign aid. Foreign aid is American soft power. We send money to countries who then are our allies instead of having to send troops to those countries, which is more expensive, and they do our bidding in the world. They monitor the world for us. Foreign aid is useful in that regard. But when our debt service is more than national defense, I have a hard time justifying a lot of what we're spending. I mean, in some countries, The Economist has the story out today that in some countries, our spending on healthcare in that country makes up more than what that country spends for everything else. It's wild. In some countries, we spend over 300% of the money in that country on healthcare compared to what that country itself spends. It's crazy. And by the way, I think it's money well spent if we can afford to do it. But when our debt service is more than our national defense budget, we're not where we were when we had a $20 trillion deficit. We're at $35 trillion and climbing. $20 trillion was too high then. We got to do something, but we got to confront the problems at home. And part of the confronting the problem at home is for this administration to not sugarcoat what seems to be happening, which is an economic slowdown. And the Democrats are rushing to blame the Republicans, and it's not the Republicans' fault. It's not Donald Trump's fault. He's been in office for what? Less than 2 full months. The problem is that the Biden administration artificially stimulated the economy and provoked inflation. And we're having to undo that artificial stimulation and provocation of inflation, and that's going to cause a little bit of a hiccup in the market. The warning signs are there, though. This from the Wall Street Journal. American consumers have had a lot to fret about so far this year, between never-ending tariff headlines, stubborn inflation, and more recently, fresh fears about a recession. These concerns seem to be hitting spending by both the rich and the poor across necessities and luxuries all at once. Take low-income consumers. At an interview at the Economic Club in Chicago late February, Walmart Chief Executive Doug McMillon said budget-pressured consumers are showing stressed behavior. They're buying smaller pack sizes at the end of the month because the money runs out before the month is gone. McDonald's said in most recent earnings call that the fast food industry had a sluggish start to the year, in part because of weak demand from low-income consumers. Across the U.S. fast food industry, sales to low-income guests were down by a double-digit percentage in the fourth quarter compared to a year earlier. Dollar General on its earnings call on Thursday said customers report only having enough for basic essentials. Some are having to sacrifice even on necessities. The company doesn't expect any improvement in the economic environment this year and is watching potential changes to government entitlement programs. Dollar stores rely most heavily on food stamp benefits, which could be on the table for budget cuts. This is also from the Wall Street Journal. By the way, all these links available today in the show notes if you text data to 33777. Get them for yourself. You don't have to have me interpret them for you. Americans are stopping for gas, but they aren't grabbing their usual snacks and smokes. The change in behavior is hurting U.S. sales of Doritos, Twinkies, Heath bars, and Newport cigarettes. U.S. convenience store sales volume fell by 4.3% as prices rose in the year ended February 23rd, according to market research firm Circana. Among snacks purchased in those stores, rice cakes dropped most sharply. Well, thank God for that. Honestly, who eats rice cakes? Rice cake sales are down. That's good for America, probably. Followed by such items as dips, nuts, and jerky. Refrigerated products dropped about 7% by sales volume, and chocolate candy fell by 6%. At a Circle K store in suburban Chicago, adult consumers with children in tow hurry out the door before they're talked into buying a snack, said sales representative David Garino. Shoppers are picking up fewer items in a range of categories, from ice cream to cigarillos, he said. A big bag of chips there now costs $7. People can't afford it. It's not a necessity. They're not as willing to splurge. Consumer sentiment is turning negative. At gas stations, many drivers aren't even going inside the store after they finish pumping, says Raymond LaGuardia, the chief executive at Pepsi. Some cigarette smokers, who typically buy a carton, are now grabbing a single pack instead. To entice convenience store shoppers, Pepsi is developing mini meals like Doritos loaded with warm nacho cheese sauce and other toppings. Smucker's is rolling out limited edition cherry-flavored Twinkies at 7-Eleven. That sounds disgusting. And Reynolds America is trying to reach price-sensitive smokers with more affordable Newport cigarettes. The downturn has weighed on Smucker's recently acquired Hostess brand. People don't want the Twinkies or the Ding Dongs, which used to be I guess now they're the King Dongs. They were the Ding Dongs, but the Ding Dong and the Twinkie, too many people made jokes and they changed it. I can't keep up. Dollar General, the CEO said on Thursday that inflation continues to hurt the customers that its stores and that macroeconomic environment hasn't improved. Our customers continue to report that their financial situation has worsened over the last year as they've been negatively impacted by ongoing inflation. Many of our customers report they only have enough money for basic essentials, with some noting that they've had to sacrifice even on the necessities. Now I want to go in the Wayback Machine. I want to go back to November, when your host on this program told you that all of the pent-up issues about inflation would suddenly spring forth the moment Donald Trump was sworn into office. I said it. The day after the election in November, I told you on this program that for 4 years, the media had been dismissive of the average concerns of the average American consumer, and when Donald Trump was officially sworn in, suddenly they'd all come spilling out. Inflation was now suddenly a problem. Wasn't for 4 years, but it is now. And if you actually listen to the economic news from McDonald's and Pepsi and Circle K and from the Dollar General and from these other companies, what you're hearing is that inflation has continued to be a problem for the last year when Joe Biden was president, not Donald Trump. It's why Donald Trump should embrace this and say, folks, this is the effects of the Biden economy, but we're changing it. And yes, the change is going to be a little rocky, but he artificially propped up the economy. It caused inflation. We're undoing that. You're going to be fine. From Fortune, vacation plans are taking a dive. Research nonprofit, the Conference Board, tracks Americans who plan on taking vacation on a 6-month basis. In February, it was the lowest in 15 years, apart from the COVID-19 pandemic, which halted almost all travel. Apollo chief economist Torsten Slok blamed policy and economic uncertainty in a research note published Wednesday. Quote, the biggest downside risk is that policy uncertainty could create a sudden stop in the economy where consumers stop buying cars, stop going to restaurants, stop going on vacation, and companies stop hiring and stop doing capex, he wrote, referring to capital expenditures, basically the money companies spend to acquire, maintain, or improve long-term assets. The policy uncertainty he references lie with Donald Trump's tariffs and Elon Musk's Doge. There are associated costs associated with changing trade policy and changing the size of the government sector, and the immediate question for markets is how big the short-term pain will be. Tariffs are, I think, inarguably a bit of the problem for the president. Doge is not really part of the problem. Doge really is not that big of a deal if we're really honest about it. Reducing the size and scope of the federal government is actually a good thing. Reducing the size and scope of the federal government actually is a smart thing to do. Reducing the size and scope of the federal government will allow money back into the private sector. And I think that's something the president, because of his business background, can explain better than most, with most people giving him the benefit of the doubt because of his background. That every dollar spent on the government is a dollar not spent in the private sector. And by reducing the size of government, the money can be redirected into the private sector. And yes, right now we're in that awkward transition. There's some turbulence. There are some rapids as the money flows instead from the government to the private sector. It's causing some turbulence in the water, but it's going to be positive. Give it a chance. And the brilliance is that it's happening here now at the beginning of his term. He's got more than a year and a half before the midterms. If he can show the redirecting the money to the private sector from the public sector is actually going to be a good thing, people are going to buy in. If he explains honestly that Biden was artificially propping up the economy and blowing out the debt and the deficit, and we're going to rein that in so the private sector can grow, we're going to deregulate, it's a good thing. The EPA announcing the biggest deregulatory effort from the EPA ever, that's going to stimulate the economy. It's going to have a deeply stimulative effect, but there's no reason to stick your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening. There's no reason to try to say this isn't real. It is real. The data shows it's real, and it's Joe Biden's problem, not Donald Trump's problem, but Trump is there now, and Republicans are pretending we can't make eye contact with it, la, 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 la. No, make eye contact with it. Point out what Joe Biden did. Point out the sabotage to the economy by Joe Biden. Listen, Americans rejected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris because of the economy. You still have a runway onto which you can blame the Democrats for the current predicament, for the current circumstances. And the media covered up for them for 4 years, and now the media thinks these things are a problem. Throw it all in their face. The cover-up of the media until now. All of these companies that have come out, all of the statements I've read have pointed out this problem has existed for over a year. When the media told you everything was fine, and it was not true, it is not true, and it's time for the Trump administration to just come out with the American people and say, listen, we're reducing the size and scope of the federal government because every dollar spent there is not a dollar spent on your salary. It's not a dollar spent investing in your company. It's not a dollar spent buying stock. It's a dollar spent growing government. We're going to stop that so the money flows to the private sector and makes the American private sector economy the strongest in the world. You do that, Americans are going to buy in and believe it because it's true. It's the truth. Trump can sell it better than anyone else.